In the shadow of Thunder Mountains, 1887, a lone woman stands between sacred Apache waters and men drunk with gold fever. Sarah Holloway was just another settler until the day she witnessed prospectors polluting the hidden spring. Something ancient stirred within her that day, a connection to the land deeper than roots. While other settlers chase fortune, Sarah raises her rifle against the invaders, her voice carrying across the canyons with unexpected power. The Apache elders watch from afar, recognizing something their ancestors foretold: a bridge between worlds when the mountains would need a new guardian. But what happens when a woman with no Apache blood becomes keeper of their most sacred mysteries? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Holloway had known Thunder Valley since before she could remember. Born to settlers who ventured farther west than most dared, she had grown up with the mountains as her playmates and the valley winds as her lullabies. The old leather-bound journal on her cabin shelf, her mother's legacy, contained pressed wildflowers and careful notes about which plants healed and which harmed. Sarah often traced the faded handwriting with her fingertips, as if touch might summon her mother's voice from the silence of 10 winters past. The fever had taken both, her parents within a fortnight of each other. Sarah was 22 then, already considered an old maid by most, but she had never found town life or suitors as compelling as the quiet conversations she held with the wilderness. After burying her mother and father on the gentle slope behind their cabin, she had simply continued on, tending their small homestead with the same quiet determination that had defined her family's survival. Peculiar, the townsfolk called her when they thought she couldn't hear. That strange widow woman, they said, though she had never married. Sarah let them talk. Town was a necessary evil she visited only when supplies ran low. Flour, coffee, ammunition, the occasional length of fabric. 4 times a year, rarely more, Mr. Abernathy at the general store was one of the few who treated her with genuine kindness, asking after her health and saving the newest seed catalogues for her perusal. He had known her parents and respected their choice to settle in the shadow of what the Apache called Thunder Mountains. "Your father always said that land spoke to him," Abernathy told her once, measuring coffee beans into a paper sack. "Said he heard it plain as day when they first came through the pass. Told him that's where they ought to stop wandering." Sarah had nodded, not sharing that she heard the land too, more clearly with each passing season. The whispers came strongest in dreams or in that hushed moment before dawn when mist clung to the valley floor. Sometimes the messages were practical, warnings of early frost or where the best huckleberries would fruit. Other times they were vague impressions, feelings rather than words, urging her to pay attention to seemingly ordinary things. A circling hawk, an unusual pattern of clouds, the way deer suddenly changed their usual paths. Her cabin stood at the confluence of 2 worlds, the last outpost of settler territory before the land rose up into what most whites considered Apache domain. The invisible boundary had held for nearly 2 decades, an unspoken agreement of mutual avoidance. The Apache rarely ventured down into the valley, and settlers wisely kept to the established homesteads rather than pushing deeper into the mountains. Sarah's daily life followed the rhythm of the seasons rather than the ticking of clocks. Spring meant tending the garden plot her mother had established. Summer brought foraging and preserving, autumn was for hunting and preparing, and winter meant mending, carving, and surviving. She kept chickens for eggs, a milk cow named Maybelle, and tended a small apple orchard that her father had planted the year she was born. The trees now stood tall and gnarled, their spring blossoms a brief snowfall of white and their fall harvest. Enough to keep her in dried apples through the lean months. Solitude suited her. In the evenings, she would sit on her porch with a cup of tea, watching the light change on the face of the mountains. Sometimes she sang softly old songs her mother had taught her, or new melodies that seemed to rise unbidden from somewhere deep within. On those nights, she often noticed deer emerging from the forest edge to listen, standing statue still until the last notes faded. There were moments when loneliness pressed in, usually during the deepest part of winter, when snow piled against. The cabin walls and wolves howled in the distance, but even then, Sarah found comfort in the quiet presence of the mountains. They had become her confidants and companions, more reliable than any human friend could be. Few knew how far she wandered. During her solitary rambles, not just along the valley floor, but up into the foothills where most settlers feared to tread, she collected plants unknown to her mother's journal, experimenting with their properties and adding her own neat notes to the margins. She learned the secret places where elk carved their young and where golden eagles nested on unreachable ledges. And once, following nothing more than an inexplicable pull, she had discovered the hidden spring, a discovery that would one day change everything. On this particular morning, Sarah had no indication that her quiet life was about to shatter. She rose with the sun as always, fed the chickens, milked Maybelle, and began her day with the comfortable certainty of routine. The weathered journal lay open on her table, a sprig of fresh yarrow laid across its pages, tomorrow's entry waiting to be recorded. The mountains stood silent sentinel, keeping their secrets for one day more. Sarah's hand drifted to the stone pendant, hanging from a leather cord around her neck, as she climbed the familiar trail. The stone, smooth river rock with a perfect natural hole through its center, had been a gift from an old Apache woman she had encountered years ago. She had found the woman collapsed on the trail, suffering from a broken ankle, and had helped her back to the edge of Apache territory. They had spoken little, the language barrier too great, but when they parted, the woman had pressed the stone into Sarah's palm with surprising strength. "Say beside," the woman had said, tapping her ear and then pointing to the stone. "Listen." It was one of the few Apache words Sarah knew. She had worn the stone ever since, and on days like today, when the dreams had been especially vivid, she found herself touching it like a talisman. Last night's dream had been the same one that had visited her repeatedly over the past moon cycle. She stood at the base of Thunder Mountain while water rose around her ankles, whispering words she couldn't quite understand. The hidden spring lay in a craggy recess halfway up the eastern slope of the smallest mountain, invisible from the valley floor. Sarah had discovered it 5 years ago while tracking a wounded doe. She had never found the deer, but instead had been drawn by the musical trickle of water over stone, following it to its source, a clear pool fed by a spring that emerged from a crack in the mountain face. The first time she had knelt beside it, cupping the crystalline water in her hands, something peculiar had happened. A sensation like a gentle current had traveled up her arms and spread throughout her body, and the whisper she sometimes heard in dreams had suddenly seemed very close, as if someone were speaking directly into her ear. She had jerked back, startled, spilling the water, but the feeling had lingered, a sense of connection, of recognition. She had returned to the spring many times since, drawn by something she couldn't name. Sometimes she brought small offerings, a perfect pine cone, a hawk feather, a particularly beautiful stone. She wasn't sure why she did this. It simply felt right, a gesture of respect. She never spoke of the spring to anyone, not even to Mr. Abernathy, who might have been the closest thing she had to a friend. The spring was her secret, a sacred communion between herself and the mountains. As she approached the hidden hollow, Sarah paused, inhaling the distinctive mineral scent of the place. The air here was different, cooler, with an electric quality that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. Sunlight filtered through the canopy of ancient pines surrounding the hollow, dappling the ground and water with shifting patterns. The spring's small pool was crystal clear, its bottom lined with smooth stones in shades of rust and amber. Sarah settled on a flat boulder beside the pool, removed her boots, and dipped her feet into the cold water. The familiar tingling sensation began immediately, traveling up from her soles to her ankles and then spreading upward. She closed her eyes, allowing the sensation to wash through her. "I had the dream again," she said aloud, her voice soft in the stillness. Speaking to the spring had become a habit over the years, a way of sorting through her thoughts. Water rising, and words I can't understand. A breeze stirred the pines overhead, sending a shower of needles spiraling down to float. On the pool's surface, Sarah watched them drift in tiny whirlpools, forming patterns that seemed almost like writing before dissolving. Her mind drifted to the changes she had noticed lately, subtle shifts in the rhythm of the valley. The elk had altered their migration route, avoiding the western slopes entirely. Crows gathered in unusual numbers at dawn, their raucous calls seeming to contain messages she strained to decipher. Even Maybelle had been restless, lowing at night as if sensing something approaching. Most telling of all were the weather patterns. Sarah had always been sensitive to the moods of the sky, a skill that had once made the townsfolk eye her with suspicion when she accurately predicted storms days before they arrived. Lately, though, her connection to these patterns had intensified. Twice in the past month, she had awakened from a dead sleep moments before lightning struck nearby, the crack of thunder seeming to answer some call in her blood. As she sat by, the spring, clouds gathered above Thunder Mountain's peak, dark and heavy with rain that the valley desperately needed after weeks of dry heat. Sarah felt the pressure building in her sinuses, a sure sign of the coming downpour. But there was something else, too. A tension in the air that spoke of change beyond the weather. "Something's coming," she murmured to the spring, watching the first heavy raindrops dimple its surface. "Something that doesn't belong here." As if in answer, a kingfisher swooped low over the pool, its harsh rattle of alarm cutting through the stillness. Sarah watched it disappear among the trees, her unease growing. She had learned long ago to trust these signs, these whispers from the earth. She gathered her boots and stood, knowing the rain would soon become a deluge. As she turned to leave, her eye caught on something unusual at the pool's edge, a single eagle feather, its tip resting in the water as if deliberately placed. Sarah hesitated, then carefully picked it up, adding it to her collection of sacred things that connected her to this place and its mysteries. Thunder rumbled overhead as she made her way back down the mountain, the stone pendant warm against her skin despite the chill of the coming storm. The town hall meeting was already underway when Sarah slipped through the back door. She rarely attended such gatherings, preferring the honest company of her mountains to the politics of men, but the notice tacked to the general store's bulletin. Board had drawn her in. Bold black letters proclaimed Thunder Mountain's mining claims, public meeting. Below, the territorial government seal lent official weight to the announcement. Sarah found a corner at the back of the crowded room, her worn buckskin jacket and practical trousers standing out amid the Sunday dresses and suits. A stranger stood at the front, tall, broad-shouldered, with the confident posture of a man accustomed to being heard. His three-piece suit was finer than anything seen in these parts, and the gold watch chain stretching across his vest caught the lamplight with each gesture. "Jefferson Hayes," Mr. Abernathy whispered, noticing Sarah. "Mining entrepreneur from Denver, been buying up claims all across the territory." Hayes spread a map across the table, weighted at the corners with polished stones that Sarah suspected were ore samples. "A deliberate display. Ladies and gentlemen of Thunder Valley," he began, his voice carrying the refined edge of Eastern education beneath a carefully cultivated Western drawl. "What you are looking at is the future, your future. The Territorial Assayer's Office has confirmed what my geologists suspected. These mountains contain gold veins that could rival the Comstock lode." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sarah watched faces transform, eyes widening, cheeks flushing with the fever she had seen claim men's reason before. Gold had that power, turning sensible farmers and shopkeepers into dreamers overnight. My company is prepared to invest substantial capital to develop these resources, Hayes continued. We'll build proper mining operations, bring in the latest equipment from back east. This means jobs, gentlemen. It means prosperity for your businesses. He nodded toward the shopkeepers. It means growth for your town, security for your families. Sarah studied him, noting the practiced sincerity in his smile that never quite reached his eyes. Behind him stood another man, leaner, harder, with a cavalry officer's bearing and a scar that pulled one corner of his mouth into a permanent half-smile. That's Caleb Stone, Abernathy whispered again. Hayes' foreman. They say he rode with Sherman through Georgia, not a man to cross. Mayor Whitfield, a cattle rancher with aspirations beyond his abilities, stepped forward. Mr. Hayes, while we certainly appreciate the opportunity for progress, some folks might have concerns about how these operations would affect our water, our grazing lands. It was a token objection, Sarah knew. The mayor's tone made it clear he had already been won. Over, Hayes' smile widened. A fair question, Mayor. I assure you, my operation maintains the highest standards. We understand the importance of responsible resource management. The practiced phrases rolled off his tongue. In fact, I've brought copies of our environmental considerations for review. He gestured, and Stone handed out official-looking documents stamped with more impressive seals. Sarah didn't need to read them to recognize empty promises wrapped in legal language. Additionally, Hayes continued, I'm prepared to offer fair compensation for any land we need to access. Generous compensation, I might add. The room erupted in excited conversation. Sarah remained silent, watching as her neighbors transformed. Before her eyes, calculating invisible fortunes, mentally spending wealth still buried in rock. Any questions? Hayes asked, confident in his conquest. An older rancher stood. What about the Apache? Those mountains border their territory. Hayes exchanged a glance with Stone before answering. The territorial governor has assured me that the Apache reservation boundaries are well established and clear. Our operations will remain entirely within areas open for development. They consider those mountains sacred, the rancher persisted. Hayes spread his hands in a gesture of reasonable regret. While I respect native traditions, gentlemen, we cannot allow superstition to impede progress. The governor has given his full support to this venture. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The casual dismissal in his tone spoke volumes. To men like Hayes, the land was merely a resource to be exploited, its value measured in ounces of precious metal rather than living water and ancient stone. As the meeting continued, Sarah slipped out, unable to bear the growing excitement in the room. Outside, the night air carried the scent of pine from the mountains. She looked up at their dark silhouettes against the star-filled sky and felt a weight settle in her chest. Foreknowledge of wounds to come. The next morning, fresh notices appeared. Throughout town, nailed to posts and tacked to the general store's door. Mining claims filed. By authority of the Territorial Mining Commission, all lands within the Thunder Mountains region are hereby declared open for mineral exploration and extraction under proper licensing from Hayes Mining Corporation. Sarah stood reading the notice, aware of Mr. Abernathy watching her from inside the store. Progress, they call it, he said when she entered to collect her monthly supplies. Some might call it something else, she replied, her voice quiet, but firm. Abernathy sighed as he measured out her flour. Times change, Sarah. Maybe it's not all bad. Town could use some new blood, new opportunities. She said nothing. But as she loaded her purchases into her wagon, she noticed Caleb Stone watching her from across the street, his scarred face impassive, his eyes missing nothing. Their gazes locked briefly before Sarah snapped the reins and turned her wagon toward home, toward the mountains that suddenly seemed more vulnerable than she had ever imagined them to be. The forest fell silent as Sarah approached the hidden hollow a week after the town meeting. No bird calls, no rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, just an unnatural stillness that raised the hair on her arms. Even before she reached the final bend in the trail, an acrid scent reached her nostrils, chemical and wrong. She moved more cautiously now, placing each foot with deliberate care to avoid snapping twigs. As she peered around a large boulder that marked the entrance to the spring sanctuary, her breath caught in her throat. 3 men worked around the spring pool. One stirred the once crystal water with a long wooden paddle, now cloudy and tinged with an oily sheen. Another crouched at the water's edge, pouring liquid mercury from a flask into a shallow pan containing crushed rock and sediment. The third man, older, directing the others, consulted a notebook, making marks with a pencil. "More quicksilver," the older man ordered. "We need to see if the amalgamation takes." Sarah watched in horror as more mercury poured into the pan, then into the spring itself. Mercury for extracting gold. She knew the process from stories her father had told of the California fields. The toxic metal bound to gold particles, separating them from worthless rock. A broken eagle feather floated on the defiled water's surface, its presence like a desecration upon a desecration. The sight of it ignited something primal within her. Without conscious thought, Sarah stepped from behind the boulder, her voice cutting through the unnatural silence. "Stop what you're doing!" The men jerked toward her, startled. The youngest, he dropped his flask, spilling mercury beads across stone. "This is a prospecting claim, ma'am." The older man recovered quickly, his tone dismissive. "Hayes Mining has rights to this entire area." "This spring is not for mining," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You're poisoning the water." The older man squinted at her. "You're the Holloway woman, ain't you? The one who lives alone down in the valley." His gaze traveled over her with insulting slowness. "This ain't your concern. Water flows down from all over these mountains. Find yourself another spring. The mercury you're using will contaminate every stream it touches," Sarah said, taking another step forward. "It'll kill fish, poison deer, maybe reach the valley water table." The youngest prospector looked uncomfortable, but the third man, broad-shouldered, with hard eyes, moved toward her. "Lady, you'd best head home. Men are working here." "This place is sacred," Sarah insisted, the word surprising her as it left her mouth. But she knew it was true, had always known it somehow. "It's not meant for you to destroy," the broad man laughed. "Sacred? To who? The Apache? You turning Injun now?" He turned to his companions. "Looks like we got ourselves a squaw lover." The older man spat tobacco juice that spattered too close to Sarah's boots to be accidental. "Listen carefully. This mountain belongs to whoever can make use of it. The territorial governor signed the papers himself. Now, unless you want trouble, I suggest you forget you saw this place." Sarah felt something rising within her, a pressure building behind her sternum, a heat that traveled up her spine to the base of her skull. The stone pendant at her throat seemed to pulse with warmth. "I'm asking you once more to leave," she said, her voice lower now, resonant in a way that made the youngest prospector take an involuntary step back. "Take your poisons and go." "And if we don't?" the broad man challenged, his hand drifting to the pistol at his hip. A gust of wind suddenly whipped through the hollow, though the trees above remained strangely still. It stirred the surface of the befouled spring, creating ripples that spread in unnatural patterns. "Then I'll make you," Sarah heard herself say, the words seeming to come from somewhere beyond her. The broad man's face darkened. "That sounds like a threat, woman, not wise out here where no one would hear you scream." The implication hung in the air between them. Sarah's fingers curled around the stone pendant, which now felt hot enough to burn. "I'm not the one who should be afraid," she said quietly. Thunder rumbled overhead, though the sky had been clear moments before. The prospectors glanced up nervously. "Waste of time," the older man muttered, closing his notebook. "We've got enough samples anyway. Let's move to the next site. To Sarah, he added, "This won't end well for you, woman. Mr. Hayes doesn't appreciate interference." They gathered their equipment hastily, the youngest casting a final troubled glance at the contaminated pool before following his companions. Sarah stood motionless until their footsteps faded, then collapsed to her knees beside the spring. The water's surface was slick with chemical residue, dead insects floating along its edges. Beneath the taint, she could feel the spring's distress like a physical pain in her own body, a wrongness that cut through her with each heartbeat. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears tracking down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry." She reached for the broken eagle feather, carefully lifting it from the polluted water. As her fingers touched it, a vision flashed behind her eyes. An eagle falling from the sky, wings beating uselessly against poison coursing through its body. Sarah clutched the feather to her chest as storm clouds gathered over Thunder Mountain, answering the rage and grief building within her. By the time the first fat raindrops began to fall, she had made her decision. The spring would not remain undefended, not while she drew breath. Dawn had barely touched the eastern sky when Sarah returned to the spring. She had spent a restless night, her dreams filled with poisoned water and dying creatures. Before first light, she had risen, taken her father's Winchester repeating rifle from its place above the mantel, and loaded it with steady hands. The weapon hadn't been fired in years, but she had maintained it meticulously, just as her father had taught her. The rifle felt both foreign and familiar in her grip, a contradiction that mirrored her own turbulent emotions. Sarah Holloway had never considered herself a violent woman. She had hunted for food, but never for sport, and had always offered thanks to the animals whose lives sustained her own. Now she carried the weapon with a different purpose, one that sat uneasily in her heart but firmly in her resolve. The spring looked worse in the pale morning light. The mercury had settled into a silvery film that clung to the rocks, and the water remained cloudy. Sarah knelt beside it, careful not to touch the contamination, and whispered an apology to the desecrated place. Then she settled on a boulder, overlooking both the spring and the trail leading to it, the Winchester across her knees, and waited. They arrived mid-morning, 5 men this time. The 3 from yesterday, plus 2 more, carrying picks and shovels. Sarah watched them approach, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her hands steady. She let them reach the edge of the hollow before standing, the rifle now raised to her shoulder. "That's far enough!" she called, her voice echoing against the stone walls of the hollow. The men froze, then the leader, the older man from yesterday, stepped forward, squinting up at her position. "Now see here, woman." The crack of the rifle split the mountain silence. Sarah had aimed well above their heads, sending a shower of pine needles and bark down upon them. The men ducked instinctively. I said, "That's far enough." Her voice sounded different to her own ears, deeper, more resonant. "This spring is not for mining. Turn around and go back to Mr. Hayes. Tell him this place is protected." "Protected by what? One woman with a rifle?" The broad-shouldered man, with hard eyes, laughed but didn't move forward. "You can't shoot all of us before we get to you." "Maybe not," Sarah agreed calmly, "but I'll make sure you're the first to fall." Something in her tone, the absolute certainty perhaps, wiped the smile from his face. "This is madness," the older man said. "We have legal rights to prospect here. The territorial government, I don't recognize their authority over this place." Sarah cut him off. "Neither do the mountains." As if in response to her words, a low rumble of thunder sounded in the distance, though the sky remained clear overhead. The men exchanged uneasy glances. The youngest, barely more than a boy, tugged at the older man's sleeve. "Mr. Wilson, maybe we should try somewhere else. Plenty of other spots to check." Wilson shook him off. "This is the spot Hayes wants surveyed today. Woman's bluffing. Try." "Me," Sarah said, her finger steady on the trigger. Wilson took a step forward. Sarah fired again, this time sending a bullet into the ground directly in front of his boots. He jumped back with a curse. "Next one won't miss," she promised. For several heartbeats, no one moved. Sarah felt something building in the air around them, a tension like the moment before lightning strikes. The stone pendant at her throat pulsed with warmth. "This ain't over," the broad-shouldered man finally said. "Hayes won't stand for this interference. You've made a powerful enemy today, woman, and you've trespassed on sacred ground," Sarah replied. "Tell Hayes if he sends more men, they'll meet the same welcome." With muttered threats and backward glances, the prospectors retreated down the trail. Sarah remained in position until they were well out of sight, then slowly lowered the rifle, surprised to find her arms trembling now that the confrontation had passed. She made her way down to the spring, wondering what to do about the contamination. The mercury would need to be removed somehow, but she had no idea how to accomplish such a task. As she stood contemplating the problem, clouds gathered with unnatural speed overhead, and within moments, rain began to fall, gently at first, then with increasing intensity. Sarah watched in wonder as the downpour seemed to concentrate over the spring, the heavy drops striking the polluted water with unusual force, creating a foam that pushed the silvery mercury to the edges of the pool where it collected in beads she could scoop away with a flat stone. "Thank you," she whispered, not entirely sure who or what she was thanking. She worked until dusk, removing as much of the poison as possible and burying it deep in a hole, far from any water source. When she finally made her way back to her cabin, she was bone-weary but resolute. She cleaned the rifle and returned it to its place above the mantel, knowing with certainty that she would need it again. That night, she slept dreamlessly for the first time in weeks, while outside her window, thunder rumbled across the mountains like distant drums. For 3 days, Sarah kept vigil at the spring. She constructed a small lean-to of pine branches on the rocky ledge overlooking the hollow, protected from the elements but offering clear sight of all approaches. The Winchester remained within, arm's reach as she slept in fitful bursts, alert to every snapping twig or shifting shadow. By the third morning, she knew she was not alone on the mountain. Nothing obvious betrayed the watchers. No careless movements or whispered voices. But Sarah felt their presence as surely as she felt the sun on her face. A sense of being observed from multiple directions, of eyes tracking her smallest gestures. Years of living in tune with the forest had honed her awareness beyond ordinary perception. At midday, while gathering firewood, she spotted the first tangible sign, a partial footprint in soft earth, smaller than a white man's boot, the impression different. Moccasined, she realized. Apache. Sarah continued her task without obvious reaction, but her mind raced. The Apache rarely ventured this far down the mountains, and never so close to settler territory without purpose. Were they watching her, or the spring? Did they see her as a threat or something else? That evening, as she stoked her small fire, she spoke aloud to the gathering darkness. "I mean no disrespect to this place. I only wish to protect it from those who would poison it for gold." No answer came, but the night birds resumed their calls after a telling silence, and Sarah felt the intensity of observation ease slightly. The fourth morning, she woke to find a hawk feather placed precisely at the entrance to her lean-to. Not dropped by chance, deliberately positioned, its tip pointing toward the spring. Sarah lifted it carefully, turning it in the early light. A message, then, but its meaning remained obscure. She placed the feather in her hair, securing it with a leather thong, hoping the gesture would be recognized as acceptance. As she moved to the spring to check its clarity, improving daily since the rain, she felt the watchers draw nearer, though still hidden among the trees. By noon, 2 more prospectors arrived, these armed with rifles of their own. Sarah confronted them from her position of advantage, her Winchester aimed with unwavering hands. "Hayes Mining Company claims this land," one called up to her, waving a paper document. "You're obstructing legal business." "There's nothing legal about poisoning." "Sacred waters," Sarah replied, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "Last warning, turn back. The men exchanged glances, then raised their rifles. Before either could aim properly, Sarah fired, the bullet splintering a branch above their heads. They ducked, cursing. "Next shot counts," she warned. What might have happened next, Sarah never discovered. From the forest came a bird call, then another and another, but with a precision that revealed human origin. The prospectors' heads snapped toward the sounds, faces paling as they registered the implication. "Apache," one whispered, rifle barrel dropping. "Damnation," the other muttered. Hayes didn't say nothing about hostiles. They retreated hastily, frequently glancing over their shoulders at the forest. Sarah maintained her position until they were well out of sight, then slowly lowered her rifle, her heart pounding in her ears. "Thank you," she said quietly to the unseen watchers. That evening, as darkness fell, Sarah sensed a change in the air, a decision made. She sat cross-legged by her small fire, waiting, the Winchester laid deliberately across her lap rather than in her hands, a gesture of peaceful intent, though she could raise it quickly if needed. A figure materialized at the edge of the firelight, a young Apache man, no more than 20, his face impassive, but his eyes alert and assessing. He carried no visible weapon, but moved with the coiled readiness of one who could defend himself instantly if threatened. They regarded each other in silence across the flames. Then the young man raised his hand, palm outward, and spoke a few words in Apache, a language Sarah did not understand beyond the few words she had picked up over the years. She mirrored his gesture, palm out. "I don't understand your words," she said softly, "but I respect your mountains." The young man studied her face, then pointed to the hawk feather in her hair and nodded once. "Gift," he said in halting English. "From Nahilzai, old woman. She watches." Sarah remembered suddenly the old Apache woman she had helped years ago with the broken ankle, the one who had given her the stone pendant. Nahilzai must be her name. "Is she well?" Sarah asked. The young man seemed to understand. He nodded again. "She say, you hear." He tapped his ear, then gestured to the mountains around them. "You hear, mountains." Before Sarah could respond, he melted back into the darkness as silently as he had appeared. But his departure felt different from his arrival, not an end, but a beginning. That night, as Sarah slept beneath her lean-to, the dreams came again. But now the incomprehensible whispers began to clarify, individual words, emerging from the flow like stones rising from a stream. She recognized them as Apache words, though she had never learned them. In the morning, she found fresh tracks around her camp. At least 3 different people had observed her during the night, yet she had slept more peacefully than before. The watchers had not withdrawn. They had established a perimeter, she realized, not to contain her, but to protect what she protected. Sarah touched the hawk feather still secured in her hair and smiled. She was no longer alone in her vigil. A week passed without further intrusion from Hayes's men. Each morning, Sarah returned to her cabin to tend to Maybelle and the chickens, then hiked back to her vigil at the spring. The routine settled into her bones like the changing seasons, natural and necessary. On the 8th day, she returned to her cabin at dawn to find something placed carefully on her doorstep. A small bundle of cedar tied with sinew, fragrant and fresh cut. Sarah recognized it immediately as a medicine offering. She had seen similar bundles left at certain places in the forest over the years. She brought it to her nose, inhaling the sharp, clean scent, then placed it carefully above her door lintel. When she returned to the spring that afternoon, she found Nahilzai waiting for her. The old woman sat by the pool, her silver-streaked hair braided with red cloth, her weathered face serene as she trailed gnarled fingers through the now clear water. She looked up as Sarah approached, dark eyes, sharp with intelligence and something else, appraisal perhaps. "Nahilzai," Sarah said softly, stopping at a respectful distance. The old woman nodded once. "Sarah Holloway," she replied, her English accented but clear. "You remember? You helped. Your ankle. Years ago. Sarah touched the stone pendant at her throat. You gave me this. Nahilzai's gaze followed the gesture. Tse bizad, she said, stone that speaks. Then she patted the ground beside her. Sit. Sarah settled next to the elder, setting her rifle aside, but within reach. A habit now. For several minutes they sat in companionable silence, watching the play of light on water. You protect Tone Nili, Nahilzai finally said. The water that flows from inside the mountain. The prospectors were poisoning it, Sarah replied. Using mercury to extract gold. Nahilzai's face darkened. Gold sickness. Old disease of white men. She looked directly at Sarah. But not you. You hear the mountain. It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. Yes, not words exactly most times, but I feel it. I hear something. The old woman nodded as, if this confirmed a long-held theory, the stone helps, opens the ears that want to listen. She gestured to the pendant. Not everyone can hear, even with help. But you, she studied Sarah's face, your mother or grandmother. One of them had Apache blood. Sarah shook her head. Not that I know of. My parents came from Tennessee. Nahilzai frowned slightly, then shrugged. The mountain chooses its own voices, doesn't always tell us why. She reached into a pouch at her waist and withdrew a handful of dried herbs, which she sprinkled into the spring while murmuring words Sarah couldn't understand. The water seemed to brighten somehow, its clarity deepening, small ripples spreading in patterns that reminded Sarah of writing. This place, Nahilzai said when she had finished, is the heart of the mountains. The water here feeds all streams. Below, if it is poisoned, all waters sicken, all creatures suffer. She looked at Sarah. The young ones wanted to kill the white diggers. I said, wait. Watch the woman who listens. The implication was clear. Lives had hung in the balance of Sarah's actions. She felt the weight of that trust settle across her shoulders. More will come, Sarah said. The man who leads them, Hayes, he won't give up easily. No. Gold sickness is strong medicine. Nahilzai reached out suddenly, pressing her palm against Sarah's sternum. But the heart that beats with the mountain is stronger. The touch sent warmth spreading through Sarah's chest, similar to what she felt from the spring, but more focused, intentional. To Nainili needs a guardian, the old woman continued. For many years, it was protected by distance and fear. White men avoided these heights. Now fear is less than greed. She withdrew her hand. The elders watch. They see you stand between. They wait to decide. Decide what? Sarah asked. If you are what the old stories tell. If you are the bridge between. Nahilzai rose with surprising grace for her age. I will come again. You will continue to watch. Yes, Sarah said without hesitation. I'll be here. Nahilzai nodded, satisfied. The young ones will watch also, from shadows. If men with guns return, you are not alone. As the old woman turned to leave, Sarah called after her. Nahilzai. What does it mean? The bridge between. The elder paused, considering. When the mountains were young, she said slowly, they spoke to all people. Then came division. Tribe against tribe, people against people. The mountains spoke less, chose few ears to hear. The old songs say a time would come when the mountains would need a new voice, one who stands between worlds. She touched her own chest. Apache here. Then she pointed to Sarah, but not Apache here. She gestured to Sarah's skin, her clothing. The songs tell of such a one? Sarah asked. Some songs, old songs. Nahilzai's expression became unreadable. We will see if they sing of you. With that, she disappeared into the forest with the silent grace of someone who had walked these paths for a lifetime. Sarah remained by the spring, contemplating the old woman's words as the afternoon light slanted through the pines. That night, in her lean-to shelter, Sarah dreamed of cedar smoke and voices singing in a language she didn't understand but somehow knew. When she woke, the words lingered on her tongue like the memory of honey, and the stone pendant at her throat hummed with quiet energy against her skin. The men arrived at noon 3 days later, 4 of them, dressed not in prospectors' rough garb, but in the polished attire of business. They wore matching badges pinned to their lapels, circular brass emblems embossed with Hayes Mining Corporation around the edge, and a pickaxe crossed with a surveyor's transit in the center. Their leader carried a leather portfolio and walked with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Sarah watched their approach from her usual vantage point, Winchester ready but not yet raised. These men carried no visible weapons, though she suspected at least some were armed beneath their city coats. "Miss Holloway?" the leader called, stopping at a respectful distance from the spring. "My name is Edward Blackwood, legal representative for Hayes Mining. We'd like a word." "If you please." Sarah stood, making herself visible but keeping to higher ground. "I'm listening." Blackwood removed his hat, a practiced gesture of false courtesy. "We understand there's been some misunderstanding regarding this property. Mr. Hayes sent us to resolve the matter amicably." "There's no misunderstanding," Sarah replied. "This spring isn't for mining. Any attempts to damage it will be met with resistance." Blackwood's smile tightened. "Miss Holloway, I have here the legal documents granting Hayes Mining exclusive mineral rights to this entire mountain range." He opened his portfolio, extracting official-looking papers with multiple seals and signatures. "Signed by the territorial governor himself. Your presence here constitutes trespassing on company property. The mountain was here long before your company, Mr. Blackwood. Before your governor, before your territory." Sarah's voice remained steady. "Its rights supersede your papers." One of the other men, younger, with spectacles and an uncertain expression, shifted uncomfortably. Blackwood shot him a warning glance before continuing. "Miss Holloway, we are prepared to be generous. Mr. Hayes understands you may have sentimental attachments to this area. He's authorized me to offer compensation." He named a sum that would have purchased a fine house in town. "A fair price for your cooperation." "The spring isn't for sale," Sarah said simply. Blackwood's veneer of politeness cracked slightly. "Perhaps I'm not being clear. You have no legal standing here. These are public lands now designated for resource development. Your interference is not just misguided, it's criminal. If you're here to threaten me with the law, Mr. Blackwood, you've wasted your journey. I answer to older authorities." The bespectacled man stepped forward unexpectedly. "Miss Holloway, if I may, I'm Thomas Reed, company geologist." His voice was different from Blackwood's, less rehearsed, more genuinely concerned. "There's a scientific aspect you should consider. This spring appears to feed into the watershed for the entire valley. If mercury contamination were to spread—" "That's enough, Reed," Blackwood interrupted sharply. To Sarah he continued, "Miss Holloway, Mr. Hayes is a reasonable man, but his patience has limits. We'll return with the territorial marshal if necessary. This region will be developed. The only question is whether you'll profit from progress or obstruct it at your peril." Throughout the exchange, Sarah had been aware of movement in the forest around them, subtle shifts of shadow that the company men hadn't noticed. The Apache watchers were present, observing. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "your papers may impress a territorial court, but they mean nothing to the people who have held these mountains sacred for generations, nothing to the creatures who drink from these waters." She stepped closer to the edge of her perch. "And nothing to me." Blackwood's face hardened. "You speak of the Apache. They have no claim here. Their reservation boundaries are clearly established miles from this location." "Boundaries drawn on your maps," Sarah countered, "not theirs." "This is absurd," Blackwood snapped, his patience evaporating. "One woman cannot halt progress, Miss Holloway. Mr. Hayes will have his mines. The only question is how difficult you want to make things for yourself." He replaced the documents in his portfolio with sharp, angry movements. We'll return with proper authority. I suggest you reconsider your position before then." As they turned to leave, Reed lingered behind. When the others were several paces ahead, he spoke quickly and quietly. "They're planning to dynamite the entire hillside next week. Sample cores suggest the richest veins run directly beneath this spring." His eyes met hers with genuine concern. "Whatever you're planning, be careful. Hayes doesn't lose gracefully." Before she could respond, he hurried after his colleagues, leaving Sarah with the chilling knowledge that the stakes had just risen considerably. Dynamite would destroy not just the spring, but the entire sacred site, perhaps permanently altering the underground flows that fed the waters. As the company men disappeared down the trail, a bird call sounded from the forest, the signal Sarah had come to recognize as the Apache Watcher's communication. She wondered how much they had understood of the exchange and what they would make of the escalating threat. That evening, as she built her fire, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle more heavily across her shoulders. The company men would return, backed by law and force. Her rifle might deter a few prospectors, but it would not stop a marshal with deputies, nor dynamite charges set in the night. She needed more than courage now. She needed wisdom, strategy, and perhaps something else, something she sensed stirring within her but couldn't yet name. Something connected to the stone pendant, the whispering waters, and the old songs Nahilzai had mentioned. As darkness fell, Sarah removed the pendant and held it in her palm, feeling its warmth pulse in time with her heartbeat. "Help me protect you," she whispered to the mountain, not knowing if her words would be heard, but feeling it was right to speak them anyway. Nahilzai returned the next evening as twilight settled over the mountains. This time she brought a small hand drum, a simple wooden hoop with deer hide stretched tightly across it, adorned with symbols painted in red ochre. "The elders have spoken," she said without preamble, settling beside Sarah's fire. "They say you may learn the old ways." Sarah, who had been preparing her evening meal, set aside her tin plate. "What old ways?" "The medicine songs," Nahilzai replied. "The words that speak to Tonanili, that protect what must be protected." She extended the drum. "For you." Sarah hesitated before accepting the gift, understanding its significance. "I'm honored, but I don't know your language." "The mountain knows your heart. Words will follow." Nahilzai tapped her own chest. "Here first, then here." She touched her lips. "The songs are older than Apache words. They come from the time when all people spoke one tongue." She demonstrated, striking the drum with her palm in a slow, steady rhythm. "Listen first, many times, then your voice will find the path." The old woman began to sing, her voice surprisingly strong and clear. The melody was unlike anything Sarah had heard before, neither the hymns of her childhood nor the folk songs of settlers. It rose and fell like wind through canyons, with sounds that seemed to mimic rushing water and distant thunder. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the unfamiliar sounds wash over her. The stone pendant at her throat grew warm, and she felt a curious resonance building in her chest, as if the song were awakening something dormant within her. When Nahilzai finished, silence held them both for several heartbeats. "That was beautiful," Sarah finally said. "What does it mean?" "It calls to the water spirit, asks for clear flow, for healing." Nahilzai pointed to the drum. "Now you try." Sarah took the drum uncertainly. Her first attempts to reproduce the rhythm were awkward, the beats uneven. Nahilzai guided her hands patiently, demonstrating the proper technique. "Not from arm," she instructed, "from heart. Let it beat like your blood beats." Sarah tried again, finding a more natural rhythm. When she had maintained it steadily for several minutes, Nahilzai nodded in approval. "Now, first words. Repeat. Tonanili, Shiuhojo." Sarah stumbled over the unfamiliar sounds, her tongue struggling with pronunciations so different from English. Nahilzai corrected her gently, breaking the phrase into smaller pieces, having Sarah repeat each segment, until it flowed more naturally. "What does it mean?" Sarah asked after many repetitions. "Sacred water, with you I am in beauty," Nahilzai translated. "It is greeting, respect, beginning." They worked through the evening, Sarah growing more comfortable with both drum and words. As the night deepened, she began to notice subtle changes in her surroundings as she practiced. The fire burning more steadily, the spring's soft gurgle becoming more pronounced, night birds drawing nearer to listen. "Something is happening," she said during a pause. "When I speak the words, I feel it." Nahilzai nodded, unsurprised. "The mountain hears you, recognizes your voice." She gestured to their surroundings. "All this, trees, stones, water, sky, all listens. Most people forget how to speak to them, but some remember." She tapped Sarah's pendant. "Some are chosen to remember." "Why me?" Sarah asked the question that had troubled her since their first meeting. "I'm not Apache. I wasn't born to your ways. The mountain does not see Apache, white woman, Mexican, Navajo." Nahilzai's weathered hand described a circle in the air. "Sees only heart that listens or heart that does not." She studied Sarah's face in the firelight. "Long ago, when my grandmother was a girl, a holy man had a vision, said a time would come when mountains would need new voice, one with feet in two worlds." "The bridge between," Sarah recalled their earlier conversation. "Yes, some elders believe you are this one. Others," Nahilzai shrugged, "others wait to see." They practiced until midnight, Sarah's throat growing hoarse but her confidence strengthening. The strange syllables began to feel more natural on her tongue, and she found herself anticipating the next phrases before Nahilzai taught them. "You learn quickly," the old woman observed. "The words know you already." As Nahilzai prepared to leave, she placed her hand on Sarah's forehead in a gesture of blessing. "Practice until dawn, then sleep. The songs will continue in your dreams." "Will you return tomorrow?" Sarah asked, "when sun touches western peaks." Nahilzai gathered her shawl around her shoulders. "Company men return soon with more papers, more threats." "Yes," Sarah confirmed, "and dynamite according to their geologist." Nahilzai's expression hardened. "Then we have little time. Tomorrow water protection song, strong medicine." She met Sarah's eyes directly. "You must be ready when they come." After the old woman departed, Sarah continued practicing, her voice joining with the night sounds of the mountain. The rhythm of the drum seemed to match her heartbeat, and the foreign words began to feel as natural as her native English. Sometime, near dawn, as the eastern sky lightened, Sarah felt a shift, subtle but unmistakable. The spring's burbling changed pitch, responding to her song. A sudden gust of wind circled the hollow. Though the surrounding forest remained still, the pendant at her throat pulsed with warmth that spread throughout her body. For a brief, startling moment, Sarah thought she could see the flow of water. Beneath the ground, blue-silver streams branching like veins through rock and soil. The vision faded quickly, but left her with a bone-deep certainty. The songs were more than words. They were keys, unlocking something ancient and powerful. When she finally slept, curled in her lean-to shelter, the songs continued as Nahilzai had promised, flowing through her dreams like the sacred waters themselves, teaching her what her waking mind could not yet grasp. 3 days of practice transformed Sarah in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. Her voice changed first, developing a resonance that seemed to carry farther than should be possible, echoing from the canyon walls with unusual clarity. When she sang the medicine songs, even whispered them, the air around her grew heavy with expectation, like the charged atmosphere before a storm. On the 4th morning, she woke to find clouds gathering above Thunder Mountain, though the sky elsewhere remained clear. As she sang the water protection song Nahilzai had taught her, rain fell in a perfect circle around the spring, nowhere else. The precision of it sent a shiver along her spine. Not fear exactly, but wonder tinged with something approaching. Reverence. That afternoon, Nahilzai arrived with a clay bowl in her hands, a shallow vessel decorated with lightning patterns etched into the red clay and filled with clear water from another spring. "The elders wish to meet you," she announced. Tonight, Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety. All of them? Those who can make the journey. They have heard of the rain circle. Nahilzai set the bowl carefully on a flat stone beside the spring. "This is strong sign." As dusk approached, shapes emerged from the forest. 5 elderly Apache, men and 2 women, their faces weathered by decades of sun and wind, their bearing dignified despite advanced age. They arranged themselves in a semicircle, watching Sarah with expressions that ranged from open curiosity to guarded skepticism. Nahilzai introduced them one by one in Apache, then translated their titles rather than names. Medicine Chief, Rain. Seer, Keeper of Songs, Mother of Stories, Fire Watcher, Wind Listener, Bone Mender. Each nodded solemnly as they were presented. "They have come to witness," Nahilzai explained, "to decide." The Medicine Chief spoke, his voice deep and rough with age. Nahilzai translated, "He asks if you understand what you have begun by defending the sacred water." "I understand that the spring must be protected," Sarah replied carefully, "that it feeds all waters below, that to poison it would harm everything that lives in these mountains." When this was translated, the elders exchanged glances. The rain seer, a woman with clouded eyes that suggested partial blindness, asked a question. "She asks if you hear the water's voice," Nahilzai interpreted. Sarah touched her pendant. "Yes. Not in words exactly, but I feel its presence, its intent." The Keeper of Songs spoke next at length, gesturing to the mountains around them. "He says the old songs tell of times when the mountains chose unexpected voices to speak through," Nahilzai translated. "When danger comes, sometimes new guardians rise. He asks if you will sing for them." Sarah hesitated, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm still learning. My pronunciation, they do not listen with ears only," Nahilzai encouraged. "Sing." Sarah lifted the drum and began the water protection song, the strongest she had learned thus far. Her voice faltered at first, then steadied as she lost herself, in the rhythm and melody that had become almost second nature over days of practice. As she sang, the wind shifted, circling the gathering like a curious animal. The clouds overhead thickened and darkened. When she reached the final refrain, her voice deepened unexpectedly, resonating with a power that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her own body. The words emerged not just from her throat, but from her chest, her bones, the very ground beneath. Her thunder rumbled overhead in perfect time with her drumbeats. When she finished, silence held the gathering. Even the spring's burble seemed momentarily hushed. The elders sat motionless, their expressions transformed from skepticism to something more complex. Wonder mixed with confirmation, as if a long-awaited sign had finally appeared. The Medicine Chief was the first to speak, his words quiet but firm. Nahilzai listened, then turned to Sarah. "He says your voice carries the mountain's thunder. This is rare gift, even among our people." She pointed to the clay bowl, where the water's surface showed not the expected reflection of clouds, but a pattern like lightning frozen in the moment of striking. "The water speaks back to you." The rain seer rose shakily to her feet, approached Sarah, and placed gnarled fingers against her throat. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her clouded eyes widening. "She feels the thunder in your blood," Nahilzai translated. "She says you are Gogai Biati, voice of Thunder Mountains." One by one the elders approached, each placing a hand briefly on Sarah's shoulder or head in what she recognized as blessing. The Wind Listener left a pinch of yellow pollen in her palm. The Mother of Stories tied a red thread around her wrist. The Bone Mender pressed a small, smooth stone into her hand to join with her pendant. Finally, the Medicine Chief stood before her. From around his neck, he removed a leather pouch and emptied its contents into the clay bowl. 4 small objects, adisai, turquoise bead, an obsidian flake, a bear claw, and a tiny bundle of herbs. As they touched the water, the lightning pattern rippled, then reformed. He says these are the 4 powers, Nahilzai explained. Stone, darkness, beast, plant. Together with water and sky, they make the 6 directions of power. She gestured to the bowl. When the pattern holds, it means acceptance. The medicine chief spoke again, his voice rising and falling in what seemed to be a formal declaration. He names you guardian of To Nainili, Nahilzai translated, voice that speaks between worlds. She paused, then added, this is great honor, great responsibility. Sarah looked around at the circle of ancient faces, each marked by decades, of protecting these mountains and their traditions, and felt both humbled and terrified by their acceptance. Tell him I will do my best to be worthy of the trust, she said softly. As Nahilzai translated, thunder rumbled again overhead. Though no rain fell, the elders nodded in unison, as if the mountain itself had confirmed their decision. That night they taught her a new song, more complex, more powerful than those she had learned before. The Thunder Voice Song, they called it, to be used only in greatest need. A twig snapped in the darkness, jolting Sarah from her light sleep. She reached for the Winchester before her eyes fully opened, adrenaline clearing the fog of fatigue instantly. 3 nights had passed since the elders' visit, and she expected Hayes's men to return any day. Don't shoot, came a harsh whisper. It's Reed, Thomas Reed. The company geologist emerged from the shadows, his spectacles reflecting moonlight. He clutched a leather portfolio to his chest, his clothing torn and dirty, his breathing labored as if he'd been running. Sarah kept the rifle trained on him. What are you doing here? I had to warn you. Reed glanced nervously over his shoulder. They're coming tomorrow at dawn, not just company men. Hayes bribed the territorial marshal. They have warrants for your arrest. For protecting a spring. Trespassing, obstruction, threatening company personnel. Reed stepped closer, still clutching the portfolio. But that's not the worst of it. He knelt, opened the portfolio, and spread out a large survey map on the ground. In the moonlight, Sarah could see it had been torn hastily from a larger document. This is what Hayes is really planning, Reed said, his finger tracing lines on the map. The spring is just the beginning. They're going to dam the entire eastern valley, divert the water for hydraulic mining operations. They've found major gold deposits throughout the range. Sarah stared at the map in dawning horror. The planned operations were massive, far beyond the exploratory prospecting she had witnessed. The entire watershed would be transformed, ancient waterways diverted or destroyed. Every stream that flows from this mountain would be affected, Reed continued. The valley's water table, the grazing lands, everything. I tried to explain the environmental impact, but Hayes doesn't care. There's too much gold at stake. Why are you telling me this? Sarah asked, studying his face for deception. You work for Hayes. Reed's expression tightened. I'm a geologist. I study the earth to understand it, not to wound it. He pushed his spectacles up with a trembling hand. My grandfather was Cherokee. I know what happens when men like Hayes decide the land is only valuable for what can be torn from it. A rustling in the forest made them both tense. Sarah recognized the sound. Apache watchers. You're being followed, she warned Reed, not just by them. He looked over his shoulder again. Stone caught me copying these documents. Hayes is foreman. I barely escaped. He touched his side, and Sarah noticed the dark stain spreading on his shirt. He winged me, but I got away in the confusion. Sarah lowered her rifle, decision made. Let me see. The wound was a bullet graze along his ribs, painful but not life-threatening, if properly cleaned. As she examined it, Reed continued urgently, There's more. Hayes has brought in dynamite, crates of it. They're planning to blast a channel through the eastern ridge, right through where we're sitting now. He grimaced as Sarah probed the wound. Once they start, they won't stop until the entire mountain is reshaped. The implications were staggering. Dynamite would not just destroy the spring, but would fundamentally alter the mountain itself, perhaps damage the underground water sources permanently. From the forest came a bird call, the signal Sarah now recognized as a warning. Someone else was approaching. "We need to move," she whispered, gathering her few possessions and helping Reed to his feet. "My cabin is safer." They made their way down the mountain in darkness, Sarah leading and Reed following painfully, clutching his side. Twice they froze at sounds of pursuit, but each time the noises faded. The Apache watchers were running interference, Sarah realized, distracting whoever hunted Reed. At her cabin, Sarah bolted the door and pulled the curtains before lighting a lamp. In better light, Reed's condition looked worse, his face pale, and drawn dark circles beneath his eyes. "They'll look for me here," he said, as she cleaned his wound with whiskey that made him hiss through clenched teeth. "Let them try," Sarah replied, nodding toward the loaded shotgun propped by the door. She bandaged his side with clean cloth, then helped him to a chair. Reed spread the stolen map on her table. "You need to understand exactly what they're planning. It's not just the spring, it's—" His voice trailed off as the sound of hoofbeats approached the cabin. Sarah extinguished the lamp and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. Riders with lanterns circled her yard, at least 6 men, led by a figure she recognized even in darkness. Caleb Stone, Hayes' foreman. "Holloway!" Stone's voice carried clearly through the night. "We know you're harboring a thief. Send Reed out, and we'll forget your involvement." Sarah turned to Reed, who shook his head frantically. "He'll kill me. He has orders to recover those documents and eliminate any complications." The term hung in the air between them, clinical language for murder. "Check the barn," Stone ordered his men, "and the root cellar." Sarah made her decision. "There's a space beneath the floorboards in my pantry. My father built it during the border troubles." She helped Reed to his feet. "Get in there and stay. Silent, no matter what happens." "What are you going to do?" Reed asked as she led him to the hiding place. Sarah's hand went to the stone pendant at her throat, warm against her skin. "I'm going to sing to the mountain," she said, and something in her voice made Reed stare at her with new understanding. After concealing Reed and the incriminating documents, Sarah took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and opened the cabin door. To face Stone and his men. Behind her, hidden beneath rough floorboards, Thomas Reed clutched his wounded side and listened as the first notes of a song unlike any he had ever heard rose into the night air. A song that seemed to make the very ground tremble beneath the horses' hooves. Dawn filtered through the cabin windows, illuminating the aftermath of the night's confrontation. Stone and his men had searched the property thoroughly, but had eventually withdrawn after finding no trace of Reed. Sarah's singing had unsettled them, the strange words and eerie resonance of her voice causing even the hardened foreman to eye her with suspicion bordering on fear. "She's touched in the head," she had overheard one man mutter. Singing in Injun tongue like that. Stone had promised to return with the marshal, his parting words a clear threat. "This isn't finished, Holloway." Now Sarah tended to Reed's wound, which had festered slightly overnight despite her care. His skin felt hot to the touch, fever beginning to take hold. "I need to get back to the spring," she told him, changing his bandages. "Hayes won't wait. If they start blasting—" "Go," Reed urged weakly. "I'll be fine here." A soft knock at the door made them both tense. Sarah reached for the shotgun, then relaxed as a familiar bird call sounded, the Apache signal. She opened the door to find Nahilzai waiting, accompanied by 2 younger women carrying baskets of herbs and medicines. "We watched the nightmen," the elder said, stepping inside without invitation. "Bad spirit in the scarred one." "Stone," Sarah confirmed. "Hayes' foreman." Nahilzai's gaze fell on Reed, assessing his condition with experienced eyes. "This one different. Good heart, sick body." She gestured to her companions. "They will tend him. You must return to Nainili." The 2 Apache women moved to Reed's side, unpacking their baskets. He watched them warily until one applied a poultice to his wound that brought immediate relief, the tension in his face easing visibly. "The elders sent this," Nahilzai said, presenting Sarah with a small medicine pouch decorated with porcupine quills and containing items that rattled softly, for protection. 4 sacred plants, bare root, lightning-struck wood, stone from mountain heart. Sarah accepted the gift, feeling its spiritual weight beyond its physical lightness. "Thank you." As they prepared to leave for the spring, Reed called Sarah back to his bedside. "There's something else you should know," he said, his voice low. "The dynamite shipment, it's massive, far more than needed for initial blasting. Hayes is planning to reshape the entire eastern face of the mountain in one operation." "When?" Sarah asked, dread pooling in her stomach. 2 days from now. They're positioning charges today, test blasting tomorrow at smaller sites." He gripped her wrist with surprising strength for his condition. "Sarah, if they succeed, it won't just be the spring that's destroyed. The entire watershed will be altered. All the valleys below will feel it." The responsibility settled across her shoulders like a physical weight. This was no longer about protecting a single sacred site. It was about preserving the life-giving waters for the entire region, for generations to come. Outside, as they began the climb back to the spring, dark clouds gathered above Thunder Mountain. Despite the clear sky elsewhere, a phenomenon that no longer surprised Sarah, but that caused Nahilzai to nod in approval. "The mountain knows you now," the old woman said. "Answers when you call. I don't know if I'm strong enough for what's coming," Sarah confessed, fingering the medicine pouch. "Hayes has the law behind him, men with guns, dynamite." "You are not alone," Nahilzai reminded her. "Apache warriors watch, mountain listens, water remembers." As they neared the spring, Sarah sensed a difference in the air, a heaviness, an expectancy. The stone pendant at her throat hummed against her skin, warmer than usual. "Something's changed," she said. Pausing on the trail, Nahilzai nodded, unsurprised. "The mountain prepares, gathers power." She pointed to the ridgeline where dark birds circled. "Eagles come to witness. Old ones say they carry prayers to sky spirits." At the spring, Sarah found evidence of recent intrusion. Boot prints in the soft earth, cigarette stubs, stakes hammered into the ground with surveyor's markings. Hayes' men had already been scouting for the blasting operation. The sight of these violations kindled a slow-burning anger within her. Not the hot flash of rage, but something deeper, more resolute. She knelt beside the spring, placed her hands in the cool water, and began to sing the protection songs Nahilzai had taught her. As her voice rose and fell, the clouds overhead thickened and darkened. A wind sprang up, circling the hollow with increasing speed until the trees bent and swayed. The water beneath her palms seemed to pulse in rhythm with her song, and the stone pendant glowed with warmth that spread up her arms and throughout her body. Nahilzai watched with knowing eyes as the transformation took place, not just in the environment but in Sarah herself. The hesitation was falling away, replaced by certainty, the doubt yielding to purpose. When Sarah finally rose from the spring's edge, her eyes held a new light, steady and clear as the mountain waters, yet with depths that reflected the gathering storm above. "I had a dream last night," she told Nahilzai. "I saw what would happen if the mountain falls, the valleys dying slowly, the people and animals following after. Everything connected, everything suffering." "Keeper's dream," Nahilzai nodded solemnly. "Mountain shows what must be prevented." Sarah touched the medicine pouch, then the pendant, drawing strength from both. "I need to learn the final song," she said. "The one the elders mentioned for greatest need." "Thunder voice song," Nahilzai confirmed. "Dangerous power. Once started, cannot be stopped until finished." "Teach me," Sarah said, her voice carrying the first hint of the thunder it would soon command. "Whatever comes, I need to be ready." The town hall was packed beyond capacity when Sarah stepped through the doors the following evening. Word had spread of an emergency meeting regarding Hayes mining operations, and it seemed every resident of Thunder Valley had come to hear what was happening. Sarah had left Reed recovering at her cabin, strong enough now to sit up and eat, the Apache women's medicines working what seemed like miracles on his wound. Conversations hushed as Sarah made her way through the crowd. She felt their stares. Some curious, some hostile, some uncertain. The past weeks had transformed her in ways visible even to those who knew her only as that strange widow woman. Her bearing had changed, her eyes holding a new intensity that made people step back instinctively. Mayor Whitfield stood at the front of the room, flanked by Blackwood, Hayes's legal representative, and several company men. They were in the midst of presenting the economic opportunities the expanded mining operation would bring to the region. Miss Holloway, the mayor acknowledged her arrival with obvious discomfort. We were just discussing the Hayes mining proposal. You mean their plan to dynamite Thunder Mountain and destroy the watershed? Sarah's voice carried effortlessly to every corner of the room, though she didn't raise it. Several people exchanged surprised glances at the unusual resonance. Blackwood stepped forward, his practiced smile brittle. Miss Holloway has some concerns about our operation. I assure you all, Hayes Mining adheres to the highest environmental standards. Show them the real map, Sarah interrupted. The one that details the dam, the hydraulic mining, the rerouting of every stream that feeds this valley. Murmurs rippled. Through the crowd, Blackwood's smile disappeared. These plans have been approved by territorial authorities, he said coldly. They're perfectly legal. Legal doesn't mean right. Sarah reached into her satchel and withdrew the survey map Reed had stolen. This is what they're not telling you. She spread it on a nearby table, and people crowded around to see. Ranchers, whose cattle depended on valley streams, exchanged alarmed glances. Farmers whose fields would be affected by changing water tables whispered urgently to one another. That's proprietary company information, Blackwood protested, moving to reclaim the map. A rancher blocked his way. My water rights are older than your company, mister. If what this shows is true, it's exaggerated, Blackwood cut in. The calm scale of operations is exactly as shown, came a new voice from the doorway. Thomas Reed stood there, pale but upright, supported by Mr. Abernathy. I drafted those plans myself. Every detail is accurate. The room erupted in confused conversation. Mayor Whitfield banged his gavel ineffectually, trying to restore order. Sarah felt a light touch on her arm and turned to find Nahilzai beside her. The old woman's presence in the town hall unprecedented. Behind her stood the medicine chief and two other elders, their dignified bearing drawing curious stares from the townsfolk. We come to speak, Nahilzai said quietly. If you will translate. Sarah nodded, humbled by their trust. When the noise had somewhat subsided, she raised her hand, and a strange hush fell immediately, the same compelling quality that affected the natural world, now working on the gathered humans. The Apache elders have come to address you, she announced. I will translate their words. Whispers spread. Apache here in the town hall. But no one objected, as the medicine chief stepped forward and began to speak, his voice strong despite his age. Sarah translated phrase by phrase. For 1,000 years, my people have protected Thunder Mountain and its waters. The spring that Hayes Mining would destroy is sacred, not just to Apache, but to all life that depends on its flow. The waters from that spring feed every stream in this valley, every well you draw from, every field you water. The old man continued, describing how the mountain's watershed functioned as a living system, how disrupting one part would affect all others. His knowledge of the region's hydrology was precise and extensive, earned through generations of careful observation. When he finished, a farmer stood. That's all well and good, but what do you expect us to do? Hayes has the law on his side. The law can be challenged, Reed said, stepping forward with Abernathy's help. I've studied similar cases. If enough landowners with existing water rights unite in protest, the territorial governor would be forced to review the mining grants. And meanwhile, called another voice, Hayes won't wait for legal challenges. Meanwhile, we protect the mountain, Sarah said. Not just me alone anymore, not just the Apache, all of us who depend on its waters. You're talking about physically blocking a legal mining operation, Blackwood interjected. That's criminal activity. And what Hayes plans is criminal destruction, Sarah countered, even if he's hidden it behind legal documents. An old rancher, who rarely spoke at meetings, stood up slowly. My family's been watering cattle from Split Creek for 30 years. If these plans are true, that creek would be dried up within a month. He turned to face the room. I'm with the Holloway woman on this. One by one, others voiced agreement. Not everyone, but enough. A petition was drafted, with spaces for signatures from both settlers and Apache representatives. As it circulated, Sarah watched the unprecedented sight of people who had regarded each other with suspicion for decades, now speaking earnestly, united by common threat. Two worlds join, Nahilzai observed quietly, as the old song said would happen. When the meeting finally adjourned, a plan had been formed. Riders would take the petition to the territorial capital, while others organized to physically protect the mountain from immediate blasting. The Apache offered their knowledge of mountain trails and hiding places. The settlers contributed horses, supplies, and legal standing. As Sarah stepped outside with the elders, she found Hayes' foreman, Caleb Stone, watching from across the street, his scarred face impassive, but his eyes burning with cold fury. Beside him stood Jefferson Hayes himself, a distinguished figure in an expensive coat, observing the proceedings with the calculated assessment of a man accustomed to opposition. But not defeat. They will not yield easily, the medicine chief said in Apache, following her gaze. Neither will we, Sarah replied in the same language, surprising herself with the words that now came naturally to her tongue. The elders nodded in approval as thunder rumbled overhead, though no storm clouds were visible. The sound seemed to come from the mountain itself, a warning, a promise, a gathering of power. Dawn broke over Thunder Mountain with an unnatural stillness. No birds sang, no wind stirred the pines, as if the natural world held its breath in anticipation. Sarah stood at the spring with Nahilzai and the medicine chief, watching the eastern sky lighten with streaks of crimson that sailors would have called warning. Red sky at morning, she murmured. They come soon, the medicine chief said, his weathered face solemn. Many men, much iron. He gestured to the surrounding forest, where Apache scouts had reported Hayes' preparations through the night. Dynamite charges positioned at strategic points around the mountain. Armed guards stationed at intervals, a small army of workers ready to begin operations. From below came the sound of hoofbeats, not Hayes' men, but their own allies. The ranchers and farmers who had signed the petition arrived first, followed by townspeople who had chosen to stand with them. Mr. Abernathy came, on a mule, a shotgun across his saddle. Thomas Reed rode double with a young rancher, his face pale but determined. By mid-morning, their defense force had grown to nearly 30 people, a mix of settlers and Apache, positioned strategically around the spring and along the main approach. Trails. It was an unprecedented alliance, historic in its unlikelihood, yet bound by common purpose. Hayes will have more men, Reed warned as they finalized their positions. And they'll be armed. We're not looking for a gunfight, Sarah replied, just to prevent the dynamiting until the petition reaches the governor. A young Apache scout appeared suddenly, moving so silently that several settlers jumped in surprise. He spoke rapidly to the medicine chief, who turned to Sarah. Hayes' men come, many wagons, big iron sticks. Dynamite and blasting equipment, Reed translated. And drilling machinery. Sarah touched the medicine pouch at her waist, then the stone, a pendant at her throat. Both thrummed with energy, responding to her heightened awareness. Above them, clouds began to gather despite the earlier clear sky, dark and heavy with potential. "Everyone in position," she called, her voice carrying with that strange resonance that still occasionally startled her. "Remember, we're here to protect, not provoke." She took her place at the spring itself, Nahilzai and the medicine chief flanking her. The Winchester rested against a boulder within reach, but her hands remained empty, relaxed at her sides. The small drum Nahilzai had given her hung from her belt. They heard Hayes's procession before they saw it, the rumble of wagon wheels, the snorting of draft horses, men's voices calling instructions and complaints. When they rounded the final bend in the trail, the size of the operation became clear. 3 large wagons carried drilling equipment and wooden crates marked "Explosive, handle with care." Behind them rode at least 20 men, some in mining clothes, others clearly hired guns with rifles prominently displayed. At the head of the column rode Jefferson Hayes himself, resplendent in a tailored riding coat, his gold watch chain gleaming in the strange half-light beneath the gathering clouds. Beside him, Caleb Stone sat a black stallion, his scarred face expressionless, but his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. The procession halted abruptly at the sight of the defenders, spread across the trail and surrounding forest. Hayes studied the situation with cool calculation, then urged his horse forward until he faced Sarah directly, separated only by the small pool of the sacred spring. "Miss Holloway," he said, his voice cultured but cold, "I had hoped you might see reason, but I see you've chosen the hard path." His gaze swept over the gathered defenders and led others to make the same poor choice. "We've sent a petition to the territorial governor," Sarah replied calmly, "challenging your rights to destroy this watershed. Until it's reviewed, we stand. In protection of these waters," Hayes sighed with theatrical patience. "The governor is a personal friend and significant investor in Hayes Mining. Your petition will find a comfortable home in his wastebasket." He gestured to the wagons behind him. "Progress doesn't wait for sentimentality, Miss Holloway. These mountains contain gold worth millions, a fortune that will build towns, railways, futures, and destroy something priceless in the process," Sarah countered. Hayes reached into his coat and withdrew a gleaming object, a gold pocket watch on a heavy chain. He held it up, letting it catch what little sunlight penetrated the gathering clouds. "Do you know what this is made from, Miss Holloway?" "Gold from my first claim 20 years ago, another sacred place that superstitious locals tried to protect." His smile was thin and without warmth. "They lost, progress won, as it always does." Thunder rumbled overhead, though no rain had yet fallen. The sound seemed to resonate with something in Sarah's chest, a vibration that traveled down to her fingertips. "This isn't just about gold," she said, her voice deepening slightly. "It's about water, life, things that can't be replaced once destroyed." "Poetic but irrelevant." Hayes tucked the watch away and nodded to Stone. "Proceed with the operation." Stone signaled to the men behind him. "Clear these people out. Anyone who resists is trespassing on company property." The armed men fanned out, rifles raised but not yet aimed directly at the defenders. The settlers and Apache held their ground, tension crackling in the air like the electricity of the storm building overhead. "Last warning," Stone called. "Clear the area or be removed." Sarah felt the power building within and around her. The energy of the mountain, the clouds, the sacred spring, all converging. The pendant burned against her skin, and the medicine pouch seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. This was the moment the elders had prepared her for. "I speak for Thunder Mountain," she said, her voice no longer entirely her own, resonating with a depth that made several horses whinny and back away nervously. "And it says, you shall not pass." She began to sing, not the practice song she had learned, but the thunder voice song the elders had taught her for greatest need. The words flowed from her like water from the spring, ancient syllables that seemed to catch the gathering storm and pull it closer. The clouds overhead swirled and darkened. Wind rose suddenly, whipping through the trees with unexpected force. The surface of the spring began to ripple in perfect concentric circles, though nothing physical touched it. Hayes stared at the phenomenon, momentarily startled before regaining his composure. "Parlor tricks won't stop progress, Miss Holloway." To Stone he ordered, "Begin the blasting now." As the men moved toward the wagons of dynamite, the storm broke overhead, not with gentle rain, but with a deluge that fell in sheets, instantly turning the ground to mud and the trail to a rushing stream. Lightning cracked across the sky, striking. A tree uncomfortably close to Hayes' position. "It's just a storm," Hayes shouted over the sudden roar of water and wind. "Get those charges placed." But nature itself seemed to have joined the defense. The rushing water quickly undermined wagon wheels, stranding the equipment. Lightning struck with unnatural precision near each group of men that attempted to approach the spring, driving them back without causing injury. The downpour intensified, until visibility was reduced to mere feet, and the roar of water drowned out all attempts at shouted orders. Through it all, Sarah continued to sing, her voice somehow carrying above the storm's fury, the strange syllables weaving with thunder, until they became indistinguishable. The Apache defenders had dropped to their knees, recognizing the sacred power manifesting. Even the settlers watched in awe as the woman they had known as simply odd now stood unchanged amid chaos, her hair and clothing somehow dry despite the deluge surrounding her. A flash flood roared down from the heights, a wall of water that swept away Hayes' equipment but miraculously parted around the defenders. The wagons containing dynamite were carried down slope, tumbling over each other until they came to rest hundreds of feet below, their deadly cargo scattered and soaked beyond use. Hayes himself clung to his panicked horse, his refined appearance now reduced to a drenched, mud-splattered figure hardly distinguishable from the humblest worker. For the first time, fear showed clearly on his face as he stared at Sarah. Not the woman, but the power that spoke through her. "Stone!" he shouted. "Get our men out of here!" The foreman was already organizing a retreat, his usual stoicism replaced by the wide-eyed look of a man confronting something beyond his understanding. The hired guns and workers fled down the trail, abandoning equipment and pretense of control. As suddenly as it had begun, the deluge reduced to a gentle rain. Sarah's song faded to silence, the thunder receded to distant rumbles. In the abrupt quiet that followed, she stepped forward to the edge of the spring, addressing Hayes directly. "Thunder Mountain has spoken," she said, her voice once again her own, but forever changed. "Carry its message back to your world, Mr. Hayes. Some places are not for taking." He stared at her a moment longer, calculation warring with superstition in his eyes. Without another word, he wheeled his horse and rode after his retreating men, his gold watch lost somewhere in the mud and flood. The days following what people came to call the miracle at Thunder Mountain unfolded with a dreamlike quality. Stories spread quickly, embellished with each telling of how a storm had appeared from nowhere, how water had risen to protect the mountain, how Sarah Holloway's voice had commanded the elements themselves. Some accounts claimed lightning had struck Hayes directly. It hadn't. That the flood had claimed lives. No one had died. That Sarah had transformed into an eagle before their eyes. She remained quite human. What could not be disputed was that Hayes and his operation had been driven from the mountain. The flash flood had deposited the ruined mining equipment in a tangled heap at the base of the slope, where it remained as a rusting monument to hubris. A week after the confrontation, official word arrived from the territorial capital. The petition had reached the governor, along with reports of the unusual events at Thunder Mountain. More significantly, several newspapers had picked up the story, presenting Hayes as a villain, threatening a pristine watershed with pollution and destruction. Public sentiment, even in mining-friendly territories, had turned against him. The governor, suddenly concerned about his association with the controversial project, had suspended all mining claims in the Thunder Mountain region, pending a full environmental review. It wasn't a permanent victory, but it bought precious time. Sarah received the news at her cabin, where she sat on the porch with Nahilzai and Thomas Reed. The geologist had recovered from his wound and had chosen to remain in the valley, his loyalties now firmly with its protection rather than exploitation. "It won't stop Hayes forever," Reed cautioned, reviewing the official document. "Men like him have patience when profit is at stake. He'll wait until the story fades from memory, then try again with a different approach. The mountain will be ready," Sarah said quietly. "And so will we." Nahilzai nodded in agreement. "The songs are remembered now, by you, by others who will learn." In the aftermath of the confrontation, something profound had shifted in the valley. The wall of distrust between settlers and Apache, built over decades of misunderstanding and fear, had begun to crumble. Working together to protect the mountain had created unexpected bonds. Ranchers who had once viewed the Apache with suspicion now consulted with them about grazing patterns that respected the land. Apache who had avoided the settlement now occasionally came to trade or share knowledge of weather patterns and seasonal changes. It was a fragile peace, imperfect and tentative, but real nonetheless. The most visible symbol of this new understanding arrived the following day. A formal document delivered by a territorial official bearing government seals and signatures. It proclaimed the establishment of Thunder Mountain Watershed Reserve, designating the entire region as protected from mining operations due to its critical importance to downstream agricultural interests. The true miracle, Reed explained, as they examined the document, was that it recognized both settler water rights and Apache historical claims to the area, establishing a unique dual stewardship arrangement that had no precedent in territorial law. "Someone with influence must have intervened," he mused. "This isn't the sort of protection usually granted so quickly." Sarah suspected the miracle had more worldly origins, perhaps in Hayes's competitors who saw an opportunity to block his expansion, or in politicians recognizing a chance to appear progressive without risking much. But the cause mattered less than the effect. The mountain and its waters would remain undisturbed. That evening, a mixed group gathered at the spring, Apache elders and settler leaders coming together to acknowledge what had been achieved. The medicine chief performed a blessing ceremony, sprinkling sacred corn pollen on the water's surface, while Sarah translated his words for the settlers. "He says the water remembers those who protect it," she explained, "that it will continue to nourish all who respect its gift." Mr. Abernathy, representing the town, awkwardly but sincerely offered a reciprocal blessing from the settler tradition. Words from his family's Bible about living waters and healing streams. The Apache elders listened with dignified attention, recognizing the parallel reverence beneath the different words. As twilight deepened into night, Sarah stood slightly apart, watching this unprecedented gathering with quiet wonder. The pendant at her throat hummed softly against her skin, and she felt the mountain's approval like a warm current in her blood. "Voice of Thunder Mountain," Nahilzai said, appearing beside her. "You have become what the old songs foretold, the bridge between." "Not just me," Sarah replied, gesturing to the circle of former enemies now sharing food and cautious conversation. "All of us together." The old woman smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. "The beginning only. Much to teach, much to learn." She touched Sarah's pendant gently. The mountain chose well. Above them, stars emerged in the clear night sky, the storm clouds long dispersed. From the spring came the soft murmur of water, emerging from deep within the earth, continuing its ancient journey downward to nourish the valleys below. Unchanged, undiminished, sacred in its simplicity. Spring came to Thunder Mountain with unusual vigor the following year. Wildflowers bloomed in profusion, streams ran clear and full, and wildlife returned to areas they had abandoned during the mining explorations. At the sacred spring, a young cedar sapling had taken root at the water's edge, planted there in a ceremony that united Apache tradition with settler hands. Sarah's cabin had become a place of learning and exchange. On this particular morning, she sat cross-legged in her yard with 3 young women, 2 Apache and 1 settler, the daughter of a rancher who had stood with them against haze. They practiced the simpler protection songs, their voices blending in halting but earnest harmony. "The rhythm must match your heartbeat," Sarah instructed, demonstrating with the small drum that had been her first gift from Nahilzai. "The words come from your chest, not just your throat." Thomas Reed watched from the porch, making notes in a leather-bound journal. Over the months, he'd been documenting the watershed's recovery and the unique ecological relationships of the region. His scientific observations, combined with traditional Apache knowledge, were creating an unprecedented record of the mountain's systems. "The spring's mineral composition has changed slightly," he told Sarah when the lesson concluded. "The water shows higher concentrations of compounds associated with healing properties. I can't explain it scientifically." "Not everything needs scientific explanation," Sarah replied with a smile. "Some things simply are." Reed nodded, having learned to balance his researcher's skepticism with respect for mysteries beyond his instrument's reach. "Representatives from the Smithsonian have requested my findings," he added. "There's growing interest in establishing more watershed reserves based on our model here." The protection of Thunder Mountain had indeed become something of a model. News had spread of the unusual alliance between settlers and Apache that had stopped a powerful mining operation. Officials from other territories had visited, studying the dual stewardship arrangement. Not all approved, many dismissed it as sentimentality interfering with progress, but others recognized the practical benefits of preserving critical watersheds. More surprising was the attention from distant Apache bands. Word had traveled through native networks of the voice of Thunder Mountain, the white woman who sang the old songs and commanded the waters. Tribal representatives occasionally appeared at Sarah's cabin, observing silently before engaging in careful conversation through Nahilzai's translation. "They come to see if the stories are true," the old woman had explained. "Stories grow tall in telling." Sarah had learned to accept this role with humility. "I'm just the mountain's voice," she would say, "not its power." Yet even she could not deny the changes within herself. The connection to the mountain and its waters had deepened beyond anything she could have imagined that first day at the desecrated spring. She sensed rainfall before clouds appeared, felt the movements of underground streams like currents in her own body, dreamed of eagles' flight paths before watching them trace the same routes across the sky. The settler community had adjusted to her transformation with varying degrees of acceptance. Some, like Mr. Abernathy, embraced her new role and sought her wisdom about planting times and weather predictions. Others kept a respectful distance, crossing themselves when she passed, but acknowledging her part in protecting their water sources. A few maintained that she had gone native or been bewitched, but even they could not deny the benefits that had flowed from her actions. That afternoon, Sarah climbed alone to the sacred spring. The hollow had healed completely from the mining damage, with new growth covering the scars of human intrusion. She settled beside the pool, now ringed with offerings from both cultures, eagle feathers and carved crosses, tobacco pouches and handwritten prayers, sharing space in unlikely harmony. As she trailed her fingers through the clear water, she sensed Nahilzai's approach before hearing her footsteps. "Your ears grow sharper," the old woman observed, joining her at the spring's edge. "The mountain teaches me," Sarah replied in Apache, her fluency improving steadily under Nahilzai's tutelage. They sat in comfortable silence, watching sunlight dance across the water's surface. Finally, Nahilzai spoke again. The medicine chief had another vision. He says other mountains will soon need voices, that what began here will spread like ripples in still water. Sarah considered this. Hayes has mining claims throughout the territories. If he can't have this mountain, he'll target others. Yes, but now other mountains will have defenders who know the old ways. Nahilzai gestured to the valley below, where Sarah's students practice the songs in their own homes and fields. The voice continues beyond one throat. The realization settled in Sarah with quiet certainty. Her role was not just to protect this one sacred place, but to ensure the knowledge continued, the bridge between worlds strengthened and expanded. Already, letters had arrived from distant communities facing similar threats, seeking guidance about how to stand against exploitation of their lands. "I never thought I'd become a teacher," Sarah said softly. Nahilzai laughed, the sound bright as water over stones. "The best teachers never do. They simply share what the earth has taught them." As evening approached, they performed the sunset, blessing together, their voices rising and falling in practiced harmony, Apache words from Sarah's lips as natural now as the English of her birth. Above them, clouds gathered and dispersed in patterns that seemed to respond to the ancient syllables, while the young cedar sapling at the spring's edge bent gently in a breeze that touched nothing else. "The earth remembers," Nahilzai said as they finished. "And now, so do we all." Autumn's sunlight filtered through golden aspen leaves, casting dappled patterns across the simple stone marker that stood at the edge of the sacred spring. 20 years had passed since the confrontation with Hayes mining. The cedar sapling had grown into a young tree, its branches offering shelter to birds and its roots helping to stabilize the spring's banks. The stone marker, placed 5 years ago, bore inscriptions in both English and Apache. "Sacred waters, protected by many hands," and below it, Tonanili, voice of Thunder Mountain. It was not a grave marker. Sarah Holloway still lived in her cabin in the valley below, but a testament to what had been preserved through unity and courage. Sarah climbed the familiar trail more slowly now, her hair streaked with silver though. Her back remained straight and her eyes clear. At 73, she had become a living legend in the region, respected by settlers and Apache alike, as the woman who had spoken for the mountain when it needed a voice. Behind her came a procession of children and young adults, a mixed group representing both communities, following in a tradition established years ago. Every autumn equinox, Sarah led the next generation to the spring to teach them its history and renew the protective songs. Among them walked Thomas Reed, now married to a local woman and father to 3 children who bridged cultures as naturally as breathing. His scientific work documenting the Thunder Mountain watershed had gained national recognition, influencing conservation policies across the Western Territories. More importantly, it had helped defend the mountain against renewed attempts at exploitation as the years passed. Hayes had indeed returned, just as Reed had predicted, first with legal challenges, then with political pressure, finally with offers to buy out local landowners. Each attempt had failed against the united front of the valley's residents and the legal protections they had secured. Eventually, he had turned his attention elsewhere, leaving Thunder Mountain to those who valued it beyond its mineral potential. "Gather round," Sarah called as they reached the spring. The children settled in a semicircle, faces expectant. Some were descendants of those who had stood with her 2 decades ago. Others came from families that had moved to the region after hearing of its unique harmony between peoples and the land. Sarah touched the stone marker, feeling the familiar resonance from the pendant that still hung at her throat. "This spring has flowed since before any of our grandfathers' grandfathers walked these mountains," she began, using the traditional opening she had developed over years of teaching. "It will continue long after we are gone, if we remember our responsibility to protect it." A young Apache girl, raised her hand. "Is it true you made lightning strike the gold diggers?" she asked, eyes wide with the embellished tales children still exchanged. Sarah smiled. "The mountain protected itself. I was just fortunate enough to be its voice at that moment." She led them through the history, not just the confrontation, but the alliance that had grown from it, the slow healing of divisions between peoples who had viewed each other with suspicion for generations. As she spoke, her gaze fell on the oldest children present, teenagers who would soon take on more active roles in the spring's protection. The true legacy of Thunder Mountain isn't just the water that flows from this spring, she told them. It's the understanding that some things belong to no one because they belong to everyone. The water, the air, the earth itself, these aren't possessions to be claimed, but gifts to be preserved. After sharing the history, Sarah taught them the simplest of the protection songs, different words now falling easily from Apache and settler, tongues alike. Their young voices rose in harmony, and as always happened during these ceremonies, the air grew still and attentive around them, the waters of the spring seeming to pulse in rhythm with their song. When the teaching concluded, the children scattered to explore the hollow under the watchful eyes of parents and elders. Sarah remained by the spring, joined by a young woman of 20, half Apache, half settler, and one of her most promising students. "Next year, you'll lead the teaching," Sarah told her. "It's time for a new voice." The young woman nodded solemnly, understanding the significance of the transition. "I'll honor the trust," she promised, touching the stone pendant around her own neck, a gift from Sarah on her 18th birthday. As twilight approached, the group descended the mountain, leaving the spring to its ancient solitude. Sarah lingered behind, watching the last light gild the surface of the water that had changed the course of her life and the life of the valley. "We did well, old friend," she whispered to the mountain. "Your voice continues." A soft rumble of thunder answered from the clear sky overhead, gentle acknowledgement from the heights that had chosen her long ago as their unlikely guardian. Sarah smiled and began her descent, following the trail that generations would continue to climb, protecting what could never be replaced. Below in the valley, lights twinkled from cabins and homesteads where Apache and settler families lived, in a harmony that had once seemed impossible. Children who knew only this mixed heritage would grow to guard the waters that sustained them all, carrying forward the legacy of a lone woman who had once stood against destruction and found her. Voice in the thunder,